I failed her class, but I never failed to notice her. Now, she wants to teach me again, alone. The memory of failing her class still lingered like a dull ache. I had walked into her lecture hall every week, notebook in hand, hoping to impress, hoping to understand. But no matter how many hours I spent revising, I kept falling short, and in the end, her assessment had been mercilessly final. Yet, even in failure, I couldn't deny the quiet admiration I felt for her, the way she carried herself with effortless authority, the graceful way she moved between desks, pausing to offer guidance to students without ever seeming rushed. There was something magnetic about her, a presence that drew attention not through flamboyance, but through subtle confidence. Now, standing outside her office, my stomach twisted with a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. The sign on the door, simple and professional, gave no hint of what awaited inside. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, the office light spilling through the blinds, casting narrow stripes across the floor. It felt smaller, more intimate than the lecture hall, almost private, almost like a stage for a new kind of interaction, one I wasn't quite prepared for. When I knocked, her voice came, calm and measured. "Come in." The door opened, and there she was, same composed posture, same sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything, down to the nervous tapping of my fingers. She gestured to the chair in front of her desk. "Have a seat," she said. Her voice had that same warm firmness, the kind that could command a room without raising volume. I hesitated, taking in the room. Shelves of books lined the walls, some worn at the edges, evidence of years of knowledge carefully curated. The faint aroma of her perfume, soft, floral, something understated yet intoxicating, reached me even before I fully took a seat. My fingers brushed the edge of the chair as I lowered myself, and I felt the subtle weight of her gaze, inspecting me like a careful observer. She settled behind the desk, leaning forward slightly, resting her elbows on its surface. "I wanted to talk about your results," she said, opening the file. I watched the small, precise gestures, how she flipped through the pages, how she adjusted her hair behind her ear, how her eyes lingered on mine just a little too long to feel purely professional. There was no overt flirtation, no whisper of impropriety, but the tension in the room was undeniable. I cleared my throat, trying to focus on her words rather than the sudden awareness of how close we were, how small movements, like her hand reaching for a pen, could make my pulse quicken. I noted how the sunlight caught the gold highlights in her hair, how the faint creases near her eyes deepened when she smiled briefly at something I said. Every detail seemed magnified, etched into my mind. Her voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. "You didn't quite grasp the material last semester. I think a private approach might help." I nodded, but my mind wasn't on the suggestion. Instead, it lingered on the quiet steadiness she exuded, on the subtle energy in the room, on how even failure didn't diminish the awe I felt toward her. This wasn't just a professor-student encounter, it was the beginning of something I couldn't yet name, a tension that pulled me forward, hesitant and curious all at once. The air in her office felt different that day, still professional, yet somehow warmer, closer, as though the walls themselves had leaned in to observe our interaction. I shifted nervously in the chair, aware of the space between us, aware of the faint hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustle of papers on her desk. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet room. She slid a notebook across the polished surface toward me, her fingers brushing mine ever so slightly as I reached for it. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, but it sent an unexpected jolt through me, a small spark of awareness that made my pulse quicken. I looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a brief second, the calm authority I had always associated with her seemed to soften, revealing a hint of something else, curiosity, perhaps, or careful concern. "I've been thinking about your performance last semester," she began, her tone measured but unusually gentle. "I know you're capable, but the lecture hall format didn't suit you. You need focused attention. One-on-one. A private approach." I blinked, caught off guard by the proposal. The thought of working with her alone was both exciting and nerve-wracking. My mind raced, wondering if I was reading too much into the way she looked at me, the subtle way she leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the desk as if to bridge the distance. I'd be happy to try, I stammered, aware of the unusual flutter in my chest. She smiled, just barely, a hint of warmth that made her eyes crinkle slightly at the corners. Good, she said simply, and I noticed how her fingers lingered on the notebook as she tapped a pen against it thoughtfully. We'll schedule regular sessions. I think this method will help you understand the material more deeply. There was something in her presence that made the idea of spending extended time together feel intimate, though in a way that was entirely innocent. The office seemed smaller, cozier, almost cocooned, as if it were a world separate from the rest of the campus. I was hyper-aware of the subtle movements she made, the way her hair fell in a soft curve over her shoulder, the careful, deliberate way she organized her notes, the quiet grace in her posture. Each gesture seemed to pull me in, grounding my attention entirely on her. I'll do my best, I said, trying to sound confident, though my voice betrayed a nervous edge. I was painfully aware of the rhythm of my own breathing, the slight tension in my shoulders, and yet, a strange sense of anticipation settled alongside it. Her gaze lingered on mine a moment longer than necessary, and I caught the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips, subtle but deliberate. I know you will, she replied, her voice softening in a way that felt almost personal. The words seemed to wrap around me like a quiet promise, reassuring yet full of unspoken tension. As I left her office that day, the notebook clutched in my hands, I couldn't stop replaying the small, electric moments, the brush of our fingers, the warmth of her gaze, the unexpected gentleness in her tone. The idea of repeating the course in private had shifted from academic necessity to something more, layered, charged with unspoken possibilities. I realized then that this private arrangement wasn't just about passing a class, it was the first step into a delicate, uncharted territory where admiration, respect, and something unspoken and thrilling could grow. The first session was nothing like a lecture hall. There were no rows of students, no echoes of murmured conversations, only her, the desk, and a quiet space that felt suspended in time. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in soft, warm stripes, and for a moment, the outside world seemed to disappear. I could hear the faint scratch of her pen against paper, the gentle rustle of the notebook she placed in front of me, and even the subtle shift of her weight as she leaned slightly forward, her presence somehow both commanding and comforting. We began with the basics, revisiting concepts I had struggled with, and I found myself unusually attentive, not just to the material, but to the way she explained it. Her voice was calm, steady, and somehow soothing, carrying a rhythm that made even the most complex ideas feel approachable. I noticed the way her hands moved as she gestured, delicate and precise, and how her fingers occasionally brushed the paper as she pointed out details. Every small motion seemed imbued with a quiet elegance, and I felt a pull toward her, a mix of admiration and curiosity that I struggled to suppress. At one point, I stumbled over a problem, and she leaned closer, her elbow brushing against mine lightly. The touch was accidental, fleeting, but it sent a subtle spark through me, a reminder of how small gestures could carry unspoken weight. She didn't comment on my distraction, she simply smiled, a brief, encouraging lift of her lips, and returned to her explanation. It was enough to make me feel both embarrassed and strangely elated. We paused for a moment, both of us reaching for the same pen at the same time. Our hands met, fingers brushing briefly. I withdrew instinctively, but she held my gaze, her expression calm and unassuming, as though the touch had been perfectly ordinary, yet charged with something unspoken. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, it was heavy with possibility, a quiet acknowledgement that this was more than just a tutoring session. As the session continued, I noticed more details, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the soft creases near her eyes when she smiled, the subtle inflections in her voice when she emphasized a point. Every observation deepened my fascination, and I realized I was no longer just trying to learn the material, I was drawn to her in a way that felt both exhilarating and unnerving. She asked questions not just about the content, but about how I approached the problems, guiding me to think more deeply and critically. Her method was patient, encouraging, and somehow personal, and I felt a quiet sense of connection growing between us. Each correction, each word of guidance, carried an undercurrent of care, professional, yes, but layered with subtle warmth. By the end of the session, I was exhausted from concentration but also from the intensity of being near her, observing, listening, and feeling the magnetic pull that lingered in the room. She closed her notebook with a soft snap and offered a small, satisfied smile. "You're improving," she said, her eyes meeting mine in a way that made my chest tighten. I left that day with my mind buzzing, not just with formulas and concepts, but with the undeniable realization that our connection was quietly deepening. The first private session hadn't just been a step toward academic understanding, it had been a step into something more intimate, something slow, careful, and undeniably compelling. By the time our fourth session arrived, the dynamic between us had shifted in ways neither of us fully acknowledged, at least not aloud. The academic tension had softened, replaced by a subtler, more personal connection. It was as if the room itself had become a quiet sanctuary, a place where the weight of expectation had melted, leaving only space for understanding, conversation, and a slow, tentative closeness. She began the session as usual, reviewing my notes, but today her questions strayed beyond the curriculum. "Tell me how you approached this problem," she said, her tone gentle, inviting reflection rather than correction. I hesitated, realizing she wasn't just asking about formulas and concepts, she wanted to understand how I thought, how I felt, how I navigated challenges. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, a subtle invitation to let down my guard, and I found myself answering more honestly than I had anticipated. Her reaction was quiet but perceptible. She leaned in slightly, elbows resting lightly on the desk, her hand brushing the edge of mine as she gestured toward a page. The touch was minimal, accidental, and yet it carried a warmth that seemed to linger long after contact had ended. Her eyes softened as she listened, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the steady presence of someone who genuinely saw me, not just as a student, but as a person. Encouraged, I shared more, small frustrations about balancing studies with work, lingering doubts about my own capabilities, and even fleeting worries about how I was perceived by others. She didn't respond with judgment or advice at first, she simply listened, nodding thoughtfully, her attentive presence grounding me. Then, carefully, she offered insights, not just academic, but life-oriented, gentle nudges towards self-reflection and understanding. The subtle intimacy of the session grew in quiet moments, when our hands accidentally brushed while reaching for the same notebook, when her gaze lingered on mine just a second too long, when her smile, soft and knowing, carried an unspoken reassurance. These touches were never deliberate, yet they spoke volumes, creating a rhythm of closeness that felt entirely natural. I noticed more about her that day than ever before. The slight crease near her eyes when she concentrated, the warmth in her voice when she offered encouragement, the faint perfume that seemed to follow her movements. Each detail felt magnified, each gesture amplified by the quiet of the room and the growing emotional thread between us. She, too, revealed more of herself. In fleeting comments about her own challenges or the path she had taken to get where she was, I glimpsed a depth beyond her composed exterior. She was confident, knowledgeable, and poised, but also human, capable of uncertainty, humor, and gentle vulnerability. Witnessing this side of her made me feel both honored and cautious, aware of the delicate balance we were cultivating. By the end of the session, I left with a head full of thoughts and a heart quietly stirred. Our connection had deepened, not through overt gestures, but through shared attention, trust, and the subtle weight of unspoken acknowledgement. It was no longer just about mastering the course, it was about understanding each other in the quiet spaces between words, in the fleeting touches, in the gentle rhythms of presence. And I realized, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, that this slow, careful intimacy was only just beginning. By the fifth session, the dynamic between us had grown more intricate, layered with a tension that neither of us could, or perhaps wanted to, ignore. The academic content remained the focus on the surface, but beneath it, every gesture, glance, and fleeting moment carried an unspoken weight. The quiet intimacy of our previous sessions had evolved into something charged, subtle yet unmistakable. She began the session reviewing my recent work, her fingers lightly tracing the margins of the paper as she made notes. I watched closely, aware of how each movement, so precise, so deliberate, seemed to resonate deeper than the task at hand. When her elbow brushed mine ever so slightly as she leaned closer to point something out, I felt an unexpected shiver of awareness. The touch was casual, professional even, yet it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't quite ignore. I struggled internally, trying to concentrate on the material while simultaneously becoming acutely aware of her presence. Every detail caught my attention, the soft curve of her jaw when she tilted her head to examine my notes, the subtle inflections in her voice, the way her gaze lingered on me a fraction longer than necessary. My thoughts wavered between academic focus and a heightened awareness of proximity, the tension thick but unspoken. She seemed equally attuned to the new rhythm between us. When I stumbled over a particularly tricky problem, she didn't just correct me, she paused, letting her hand hover near mine as if considering whether to guide me physically. That brief hesitation, that potential for contact, felt electric. Our eyes met, a silent acknowledgement passing between us, an unspoken conversation carried entirely in shared glances. Even mundane moments became charged. Reaching for the same pen, our fingers brushed briefly, and this time, neither of us withdrew immediately. A fleeting smile passed between us, quiet but knowing, a shared understanding of the subtle pull growing between us. The room felt smaller, more intimate, as though the world beyond the office had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us suspended in this delicate tension. Throughout the session, I became aware of a heightened sensitivity to her presence. The soft warmth radiating from her as she leaned forward, the gentle weight of her hand when resting on the desk, even the faint aroma of her perfume, each detail magnified, lingering in my mind far longer than the academic content itself. My heart raced, not from fear or embarrassment, but from the slow-building awareness of something more profound, something that extended beyond professional boundaries without overstepping them. By the end of the session, the tension had deepened, tangible yet unspoken. She closed her notebook with a soft snap, meeting my gaze with a quiet intensity that left me breathless in the best possible way. "You're improving," she said, her tone carrying a subtle warmth, a promise, and a challenge all at once. The words were simple, but the delivery made it clear that our connection had shifted, acknowledged but still delicately contained. As I walked away that day, I realized that the private sessions were no longer just about academics. Every brush of skin, every prolonged glance, every silent pause had become part of a slow, intricate dance. And somewhere deep inside, I knew we were both acutely aware of it, careful, cautious, yet irresistibly drawn to the unspoken bond building between us. That evening, the office felt smaller than ever, as if it were cocooned from the rest of the world. The sunlight had faded into a soft golden glow, and the air carried a quiet stillness that seemed to heighten every detail, the faint rustle of papers, the subtle creak of the chair as I shifted, even the rhythmic tapping of her pen as she reviewed my latest work. It was just another tutoring session on the surface, but I sensed something different tonight, a weight, a gravity to the air, a quiet invitation to step beyond the usual boundaries. I stumbled over a particularly tricky problem and sighed in frustration, dragging my hand across my face. She leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the desk, her presence grounding me without a word. "You're overthinking it," she said softly, her tone patient but intimate, as though she could read not only my mind but the anxiety curling in my chest. Her voice wrapped around me, calm and steady, and I realized that beneath the academic guidance, there was something far more personal in her attention. I looked up at her, meeting her eyes for the first time without the shield of embarrassment or hesitation. There was a warmth there, a quiet encouragement, but also something else, something I had been aware of but never dared to confront. The attraction, the longing, the subtle tension that had been simmering beneath every session, seemed to pulse between us, unspoken but undeniable. My voice trembled slightly as I said, I don't just admire your teaching. I think She didn't interrupt. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, her eyes softening, and let me continue. I swallowed hard, feeling the gravity of her gaze, the gentle weight of her presence anchoring me even as my heart raced. I think I've been feeling something more. Something I'm not sure I'm supposed to feel. And I don't know how to deal with it. Her hand hovered near mine on the desk, and for a moment, it seemed as if time slowed. Then, in the gentlest movement, she placed her hand lightly on my shoulder, a grounding touch that was intimate without being overwhelming. The warmth of her skin, the steady, reassuring pressure, made my chest tighten with a strange mix of relief and desire. Her eyes searched mine, calm and steady, and I realized she understood more than I could have imagined. "I'm glad you told me," she said softly. Her voice carried sincerity, care, and a quiet acknowledgement of her own feelings, though she chose her words carefully. "It's complicated, yes, but that doesn't mean it isn't real." The subtle tremor in her tone hinted at vulnerability, a rare glimpse beneath the composed exterior I had always admired. We sat in silence for a moment, the tension between us charged but unspoken, a delicate thread that connected us in the quiet of the office. The faint scent of her perfume, the warmth of her shoulder beneath my hand, the steady rhythm of her breathing, all of it pressed against my awareness, making it impossible to ignore the depth of the bond we were forming. When she finally withdrew her hand, she didn't step back. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, her presence a quiet reassurance that our connection, slow, careful, and charged with unspoken emotion, was mutual. In that moment, I understood that we had crossed a threshold. The academic framework had been a pretext, a gentle invitation into something more profound, an emotional intimacy neither of us had anticipated but both of us were ready to explore. The final session arrived with a quiet sense of inevitability, as if every moment leading up to this day had been gently guiding us toward it. The office, bathed in soft afternoon light, felt less like a place of instruction and more like a private sanctuary, a space carved out for connection, understanding, and the delicate unfolding of something deeper. I carried with me the lessons I had learned, not just academic, but personal, and an awareness of the bond that had grown between us over these weeks. She greeted me with her usual composed smile, though this time there was a subtle warmth, a hint of acknowledgement for the journey we had shared. The distance between us felt smaller, less measured, replaced by a quiet familiarity. As I sat, the chair brushing against hers, I noticed the soft curve of her shoulders, the way her hair fell naturally over one side of her face, and the understated elegance that had always captivated me. Every detail felt magnified, every movement imbued with significance. We began reviewing my final work, her hands moving gracefully across the pages, correcting, guiding, encouraging. Yet, the tension of previous sessions, the unspoken attraction, the quiet longing, was no longer a source of anxiety. Instead, it had settled into something comforting, a shared understanding that we had crossed the line from student and professor into a space of mutual respect, trust, and quietly simmering affection. At one point, she reached for a pen at the same time as I did, and our fingers brushed. This time, there was no hesitation, no accidental pullback. I held the touch just a fraction longer, feeling the warmth of her skin, the softness of her presence, and the subtle charge that lingered between us. She looked up at me, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of reassurance and something unspoken, a promise that this connection was real, acknowledged, and gently contained in a way that felt safe and intimate. When the academic review concluded, she leaned back in her chair, a satisfied expression on her face. "You've improved tremendously," she said softly, her voice carrying pride and warmth. I smiled, not just at the compliment, but at the deeper acknowledgement of the effort, trust, and emotional journey we had shared. As I prepared to leave, she did something unexpected yet profoundly tender. She reached out, lightly brushing a strand of hair from my forehead, her fingers lingering just enough to convey care without words. The gesture was simple, intimate, and charged with unspoken meaning. My chest tightened at the quiet steadiness of her touch, the warmth of her hand, and the gentle acknowledgement of everything we had experienced together. Before I stepped away, she offered a small, lingering smile, and for a moment, we simply held each other's gaze. It was a moment free of pressure or expectation, filled instead with shared understanding and mutual respect. We were no longer just professor and student, we were two people who had crossed boundaries carefully, intentionally, and with full awareness of the emotional weight involved. Walking out of the office that day, I carried more than the knowledge from the course. I carried the subtle thrill of connection, the quiet comfort of trust, and the gentle warmth of a slow-burning intimacy that had blossomed naturally, carefully, and beautifully. And though we returned to the world outside, I knew that what had begun in that quiet office, the shared glances, the fleeting touches, the unspoken confessions, would remain, quietly powerful, in both our hearts. If you loved this story of a slow-burning, forbidden attraction, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another heartfelt romance. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a connection that grew quietly but profoundly, just like this one?